Welcome back to KOAN Hot Talk 1080 AM 95.1 FM, the Joe Miller Show. We have with us KrisAnne Hall, constitutional law attorney, lecturer, instructor, teacher of state legislatures throughout the United States. She's an author, written 5 books, Sovereign Duty. She has her own radio show 6 days a week. We're very honored to have her taking her time away from her busy schedule to be on the show. KrisAnne Hall, welcome.
It is my pleasure, Mr. Miller, my pleasure.
Joe, please. We met each other, several weeks ago at one of your 10th Amendment speeches, and I was incredibly impressed.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that very much.
So, one of the things that we see regularly, and I talked about this last segment, about how the people have kind of one interest and one will, and yet the ruling class, those we purportedly elect, go a completely opposite direction. And we aren't just talking about Democrats, we're talking about Republicans. I mean, for crying out loud, the Boehner reelection, we could only muster 25 to vote against that. And, he's had his wings clipped a little bit as a result of what happened. But still, I mean, it's just crazy. I mean, the overwhelming majority of Republicans against his reelection. Amnesty, another great example. Today, Republicans, Senate, House, vote out a short-term budget that funds Obama's executive amnesty. And that's despite the fact that a federal court in Texas ruled that it was unconstitutional. I just don't get it. It's like D.C. is ignoring everything and going in its own direction, opposite of where the country ought to be going. What can we do?
Well, first we have to realize that Washington, D.C. is lost. We are not going to fix Washington, D.C. through Washington, D.C. George Washington warned us about this problem in his farewell address. You've got arguably the greatest or president, and not maybe even the last greatest president that we've ever seen, giving his last words as president. You might think that they would be important, and he took a lot of time, I'm sure, in deciding what it would be. And he spent a significant amount of time in his farewell address warning us against party politics. He said that political parties would be the death of our republic and has been throughout history the death of liberty. And so if we had listened to George Washington, we would be electing people based on their qualifications and, oh my goodness, even morality, rather than based on their political parties, and we wouldn't be having these problems. And it's like you said, Joe, the real issue here is there are no longer two political parties. There is one party with two different sides gathering power for themselves. I call them prostitutes for power. And we should be surprised when the prostitutes for power are more concerned about themselves than for us. I don't think so. The solution, Joe, is still with the people. The power still lies with the people, and our biggest mechanism of power lies within the states and the state governments.
Part of the problem that I've seen with respect to state legislatures, at least in Alaska, they tend to be a microcosm of what's going on at the federal level. Now, not all of them. I mean, there are some legislatures out there that are really, they're pushing the envelope, and that's encouraging. But, like, for example, our state legislature right now in Alaska, we're facing severe budget crisis with the price of oil going down to where it's at. We're going to be completely upside down in just a matter of 2 or 3 years. We're already depleting a budget reserve that we have, constitutional savings account. And yet we're hearing there are rumors coming out of Juneau from legislators that, we have to spend our way into prosperity. And these, we're talking about we have some very ultra-conservative areas of the state, some moderate areas and some not so conservative areas. But it doesn't seem to matter where these representatives and senators are coming from. They seem to have the same perspective. They're tone deaf to the people. But the positive, of course, is that we have more access to them than we do at the federal level.
Right, and that's the solution, and that's what our framers intended for when the federal government went crazy, was that the solution would be that the states would then take control of their creation and get it back into the proper perspective. The problem is that, what Jefferson said in the Declaration of Independence is true, is that governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. And the hard, cold fact is we consent to way too much government because we simply don't know any better through either apathy or ignorance. I mean, our education system doesn't teach the proper role of government anymore. And you have said, there's problems with our states. Our states have been infected by federal supremacists who believe that they are powerless and that their only purpose is to be agents of the federal government, collectors and distributors of federal money, and it establishes what I call trickle-down tyranny. And so what happens is you have this tyrannical framework in the federal government where the will of the people no longer matters. It's just the will of the special interests and the pockets of the politicians that make all the decisions. And so then the states who are receiving all their funding and all their power from the federal government get this trickle-down tyranny ideology. So they see what the feds are doing to the people, and they say, you know what, it works. We can do this to the people too, and we can be operating like they are. Because, the cold hard fact is, number one, we don't understand why our country was set up the way it was. We don't understand where our liberties come from. We think that the Constitution was written in 1787, that we became independent from Great Britain on July 4th, 1776, and our Constitution was written by a bunch of flawed guys, a bunch of rich white guys who just wanted to evade paying taxes and set up another corporation, corporate large government just like the one that they left. When the truth of the matter is, and this is what I teach all over the country, Joe, is that our Constitution is the culmination, the product of 700 years of history. There are 5 constitutions that were written over 700 years that make our Declaration, our Constitution, our Bill of Rights. There's absolutely nothing new, nothing novel in any of those documents. They're all pieced together from these 5 documents. And when you hear the history that made these 5 documents and the history that makes our Constitution, you cannot deny, number one, that history repeats, and number two, that we are repeating with great specificity the errors of our forefathers.
Well, don't you think that part of it is not just a lack of understanding of the Constitution, but the power of the purse? I mean, one of the things that we see, even where, like in Common Core, where, the vast majority, at least, of conservatives in Alaska totally opposed to it, and yet still governor, going forward with Common Core advocates on the school board, still funding for the programs that push Common Core. It's all a money game. They get,
right,
hundreds of millions of dollars from the feds if they comply with the directives or the grants, and, they're addicted. I mean, it's a drug, basically, that brings us into servitude.
It's ironic, though, that you use that term, the power of the purse, because it's absolutely the power of the purse that our framers put in our hands to force the government to redress our grievances. It's the power of the purse that was placed in the hands of the House alone under Article 1, Section 7 that says that, if our conservative Republicans in the House wanted to defund the unconstitutional actions of amnesty by the executive branch, that they could do that. And without the Senate, they can do that. That's what Article 1, Section 7 says, that all the funding comes from the House of Representatives to fund or defund, and the Senate may propose amendments.
Okay, KrisAnne, we got to go. We'll take this up. We're at the bottom of the hour. More with KrisAnne Hall in just a minute. The Joe Miller Show. Welcome back to KOAN Hot Talk 1080 AM 95.1 FM, The Joe Miller Show. KrisAnne Hall is on the line with us, constitutional law attorney, author, written 5 books, including Sovereign Duty, has a radio show 6 days a week. And I have personally heard her speak at a 10th Amendment dinner before a state legislature in the lower 48. It looks like she may be doing the same sort of thing up in Alaska. You're due to be up here in late August, early September, right?
Right. We have two weeks blocked out, August 24th through September 7th right now. And I speak on lots of issues based on the history of the Constitution. I have First Amendment presentations, Second Amendment, 10th Amendment presentations. I actually have, Joe, a presentation now that I'm giving to sheriffs, I've had the sheriff of Eddy County, New Mexico, sheriff of Smith County, Texas, have me come in and teach their deputies. The sheriff in Smith County actually gave the Texas Sheriff's Department gave his deputies 4 hours of educational credit for my presentations on that. I've taught
phenomenal.
the legislators of, pardon?
Yeah. Well, Larry Pratt was on the show yesterday, head of Gun Owners of America, and he went to
I know Larry. He's a great guy.
He is phenomenal. Yeah, fighting the fight of freedom. And he was at one of Sheriff Mack's national symposiums, and I guess there were several hundred sheriffs there. And he was pretty amazed at what he heard, the discussions between sheriffs as to what their approach will be in the future. But unfortunately for Alaska, we don't have sheriffs. There are some local police departments, but law enforcement is pretty much state directed. So in order to actually have
them too.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
When I teach, Joe, I don't have any speaking fees, and I don't require anybody to compensate me for travel or accommodations. So when I get to where I'm going, I like to have lots of meetings, because then, we have books and that sort of thing, and we get lots of people to teach. So it doesn't really cost anybody to schedule me for a meeting. We teach high school, middle school, college campuses, Republican groups. Joe, I have even taught a couple bar associations across the country.
And you didn't get laughed out, huh?
No. They were intimidated by the truth, I think. Nobody said anything to me.
Well, on that note, one of the things that just amazes me, that the federal courts, state courts also, they don't really, even though all judicial officers, all lawyers take an oath to the Constitution, they really don't mean it, do they? I mean, to them, the Constitution is not what it says. It's whatever twisted interpretation the higher courts have given it. So even if the Constitution, I've used this as an example before, says black is black and white is white, if a higher court judge says, no, white is black and black is white, then from their perspective, they've got to follow what that higher court says, even though the clear language of the Constitution says otherwise. Now, you're a member of the bar, I'm sure. I mean, I'm not sure if you're practicing now or not, but is that your approach? Would that be your approach if you sat on the bench?
Well, I am not practicing. As a matter of fact, I teach too much. I taught 265 times in 22 states last year, so that means I don't get to take a class. I don't get to take any cases. But, the problem here is this. Number one, you can't keep an oath when you don't understand what that oath is about. It's not that they're, give them the benefit of the doubt. I don't think they're conscientiously determining that they're not going to support the Constitution. They just simply don't know. Because we don't teach the Constitution in law school. We teach constitutional law, which teaches that judges and lawyers know more about the Constitution than the men who wrote it, and teaches lawyers how to argue and circumvent the Constitution rather than to support it. And so it's impossible to actually keep the promise of supporting a document when your entire training is contrary to that.
Well, so what do you think the answer is to that? I suggested that at least at the judicial level, really the only possible resolution is to start impeaching, have the legislature do its constitutional duty, let folk know that, look, your approach is incorrect. Obviously, education has got to be done at the lower levels too, but what do we do now?
The key here is education. The reason that the legislatures won't impeach is because they don't know any different. The majority of your legislators are lawyers as well, who have been taught the same thing that the judges have been taught. And again, it's like I mentioned in the first section, our states have been taken over by federal supremacists who have failed to recognize that we are not an oligarchy ruled by courts, but we are a republic where the power comes from the people, and the majority of that power rests in the states. So that's what my book, Sovereign Duty, is about. It teaches us what our framers put in our hands as a solution to when the federal government goes out of control. And the crazy thing is the more you study the framers, you read what they wrote, not what somebody interpreted about their writings, you understand that they anticipated what we're seeing. Because, again, it's just the repetition of history and the fact that human nature never changes. And so they gave us a plan to deal with the federal government when it gets to be closer and closer to the workings of a kingdom. And the majority of their solution rested within the sovereignty of the states, the fact that the states created the contract called the Constitution, the states ratified the contract called the Constitution, and it was the Constitution that created the central government in a limited and defined form. And so since the states are the creators, it's their responsibility to make sure the creation operates in the manner it was created.
So is it your position that the Constitution needs to be tweaked so that we can actually enforce more readily the sovereignty of the state against the federal government? You know, we've had Mark Levin and his Liberty Amendments, the Countermand Amendments out. There have been all sorts of proposals to give us, I guess, more teeth in that document to help us out to regain control of the federal government. What's your view?
Well, you know, what we need to talk about is an Article 5 convention. Now, the Article 5 convention is part of the Constitution. Our framers put it in our hands. Jefferson thought that we would use it to expand liberty as we became more civilized in society. And the problem with using an Article 5 convention to tweak the Constitution to actually control the federal government is a problem that's not, you know, something that's original to me, but to James Madison. James Madison said, if we go to tweaking the Constitution in the future in order to control the federal government, he says you're likely going to have a very large problem. And the problem rests around who are the delegates. Madison explained that, you know, the only reason we're able to have this convention now is because we've just come from a bloody revolution, and the horrors of what we saw has kept every member of this convention focused on liberty. He said in the future, without that kind of motivation, he said you will find that the convention and its delegates will be built of people who will be more concerned about their own personal gain, their own political power, their own special interests, and you will quite likely find that the delegates are built of the same people who created the problem, and we will be now asking them to fix the problem. And if they are not following the Constitution now, how does adding an amendment make them follow it in the future? I don't know about you, Joe, but shall not be infringed is some pretty clear language, and we can't even follow that.
And the history of it is very clear. It was designed as a limiting document, not one to empower, right, but to reduce power and to ensure against the type of thing that's happened now, you know, in our modern body politic. Part of my concern looking forward to Article 5 or any of the other proposals for amendment is the co-option that could potentially occur. And that's what you were talking about with the delegates. But, I mean, we know that, for example, George Soros and the others that are very much, you know, spending money and effort, influence to bring about certain things in our government are not going to leave this alone if it appears that enough states will ratify and move this process forward. They'll definitely try to get involved and perhaps even then expand the power more or reduce national sovereignty down beneath international sovereignty. There are all sorts of theories about what could happen. And my perspective is you've got a constitution. It means what it says. We just need to have judges, which you rightly pointed out need to be educated, but judges that will properly apply it.
Well, more importantly, we need states who understand that they are more powerful than the judges and that they have more authority than the judges to determine what's constitutional and not. And, you know, the real problem is the fact that our checks and balances are not working. Now, in my book, Sovereign Duty, I spend an entire chapter on the Article 5 Convention, and not what my concerns were, but again, reiterating the concerns of our framers and the misapplication of this. But you see, Article 1, Section 7 is part of the Constitution. Article 1, Section 7 puts the power of the purse solely in the hands of the House of Representatives alone. A majority in the House decides what we spend on and what we don't spend on. And James Madison made it perfectly clear that the reason that all of this power was vested in the House alone was because the House was the direct representatives of the people, and that the power of the purse is the most powerful tool for the people to have their grievances redressed. And so when the House refuses to use that power to defund executive agencies that are completely and totally unconstitutional, what good is an amendment going to do? I had a conversation with Michael Ferris about my concerns, which are not mine, the framers' concerns. And the one question that I asked Mr. Ferris was this. In all honesty, Michael Ferris, what is going to be the time frame for actual complete, from beginning to end and ratification of an amendment? And he said, well, in honesty, probably a minimum of 5 years. Now, that's, by my calculation, Joe, that's a very generous estimate, because we know that there are people waiting to file some lawsuits right now. And if we're actually able to have a successful amendment, I'm thinking it's probably going to be more like 10 years before we can ever have, all the states agree and ratify and the Constitution be amended properly. But here's the point, and I'll ask you, Joe, even if it is 5 years, do we have 5 years to fix this problem?
Absolutely not. I mean, we're at a critical stage now. And, we want to talk more about that and some of the other things. One of the issues that is basically been prompted up by recent executive vetoes, the Keystone Pipeline. We'll touch on that next segment, as well as maybe a little bit more discussion as to the repository of liberty that some states have in the sheriff's departments. Back with KrisAnne Hall in just a few. Welcome back to KOAN Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM, The Joe Miller Show. KrisAnne Hall on the line with us, constitutional law attorney, guest lecturer, instructor, teacher to state legislatures throughout the United States, written 5 books, including Sovereign Duty. So, KrisAnne, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about something that you mentioned during the break, which was a surprise to me because I haven't heard many pundits talk about this. But you're actually celebrating the veto of Keystone Pipeline. Why?
Yeah, I am. Obama did us a favor because the language of H.R. 3, which is the Northern Route Approval Act, the one that was vetoed, is completely unconstitutional. And basically what it does is it establishes a private-public partnership with a foreign private corporation, which gives this foreign private corporation the power of the U.S. government on our soil. And I honestly didn't know anything about it until I had read something that Justin Amash wrote about why he refused to vote for it. And I actually went in and read the bill, and it's a very scary bill. It hands over to this private Canadian foreign corporation the power of eminent domain to take U.S. people's land without real due process. And then if you have any legal claim against this private foreign corporation, Congress says you can't sue them in your local jurisdiction. You can only sue them in Washington, D.C. Circuit Court, which means anybody who is along the Trans-Canadian Pipeline pathway, if they are going to dispute the taking of their land, which should be ridiculous to us, a private foreign corporation taking our land, then they can't do it in their home state. They have to go to Washington, D.C. and file a federal lawsuit against this private foreign corporation.
So very high transaction cost.
Yeah, which is Joe, that's the elimination of due process. The expense of doing something like that is just astronomical. And then Congress, within H.R. 3, has written in exemptions for this private foreign corporation, which allows them to circumvent environmental regulation, Department of State regulation, and then states in the language of the bill that they had to do this because this bill, this Trans-Canadian Pipeline, will create jobs and improve the economy. And so basically what Congress is telling us through H.R. 3 is that they know that the EPA regulations, that the State Department's regulations, that the federal government's regulations are stifling to economy and stifling to jobs. So they had to write in an exemption for this foreign corporation, this single, just one single foreign corporation to have exemptions from all these regulations that they want to apply to every single person in the United States otherwise.
Well, that's kind of music to the ears of Alaskans that there's a constitutional reason to stand against Keystone because we want high oil prices here. 90% of our state government is funded that way. But that is a very articulate, I think, important explanation as to why we need to really watch legislation that comes down the pike and not just, take hook, line, and sinker what the Republicans are telling us to support. I would assume that you're also opposed to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, that Obama, Yeah,
I'm
go ahead.
opposed to all public-private partnerships. I want to tell your listeners, Joe, that there is an article on my website called Jobs, Oil, Trump Constitution. If they want to see in writing and me outlining by section why H.R. 3 is unconstitutional and wrong, then they can go to my website and read that article.
Okay, very well. And I assume that they can also get your books there?
They can get my books there. They can listen to my podcast. They're only 38 minutes long. I only have an hour show, which is 38 minutes real time. And I have training videos, and they can catch me on Facebook and Twitter there as well.
So we just have a few minutes left, but I want you to tell our listeners what you see as maybe the most positive development, or maybe just 2 or 3 positive developments that you've seen as far as state legislatures standing up to the federal government.
I love Kansas. I love the letters that the governor of Kansas and the Secretary of State, Chris Kobach, sent to Eric Holder when Kansas passed a law that said there'll be no federal gun laws enforced here, and if the feds try to, we will arrest them for state crimes. And then Eric Holder sent a letter threatening Kansas, and the governor and Chris Kobach sent back letters saying, you know what, we are right, you are wrong, and if you disagree, why don't you come on and see what happens? I think that is awesome. Utah is doing the same thing.
And we talked about this during the break, but you think the federal government many times it's just bluster. Is that right? Schoolyard bully is how you described it.
Right. Well, they are schoolyard bullies because they really have no power. They're all bark and no bite. And because the real dirty little secret is this, Joe, they don't have the funds or the manpower to enforce the law in which they'd like to. They rely on our local law enforcement and our sheriffs and our state legislators to do their bidding. And so if we get constitutionally minded officers, oath-taking officers in our states and local governments who realize what the federal government is doing is wrong, is completely unlawful, and has no power in their states, then the federal government is left to do nothing because they don't have the power to do it.
Well, let's hope people get educated. Trey Gowdy had a wonderful speech from the floor of the House about basically the rule of law being abandoned by the Obama administration, and he warned Democrats not to go down that road. We have just about a minute left. Again, how can our listeners get in touch with you, learn more about your views on the 10th Amendment, the Constitution?
They can find me at KrisAnneHall.com, KrisAnnehall.com. And they can go and watch my videos and listen to my training. I have just one statement to Trey Gowdy, and Trey Gowdy needs to look in the GOP mirror because it's the House of Representatives that is doing the worst to the Constitution than the President of the United States by their neglect.
Well, I appreciate KrisAnne Hall, your views, your steadfastness, the work that you're doing across the country. We'd like to have you back. Look forward to you coming up to the great land here, and thank you for taking your time.
Anytime, Joe. Thank you.